So I certainly have kind of branded myself a little bit as an analytics guy to some degree. I find value in analytics for sure, but really what I like is the scientific method. That's kind of what I base this stuff around. I want to see how much data do we have? Can we get a big sample size? And can we put it all on a spreadsheet and just figure some stuff out? It's not going to get us entirely there. Football isn't a baseball type sport where it's a bunch of one-on-one matchups. There's so many different variables that go into it that you're never going to get it perfectly defined, but I think that doing this stuff can be fascinating. And so that being said, what are ways that we can use the scientific method to apply to football? Well, one thing that I did last year was I kind of just said, okay, well, let's look at certain positions and talk about the traits that it takes to be good at said positions. What are certain things that people value? And then let's talk about which ones should we value. So, for example, for a pass rush, one of the things that I did was I said, okay, let's look at every single pass rusher who was drafted in the first or second round in the past 10 years. Now let's look at guys who were drafted because they were good, guys with power, and then guys who basically got most of their wins through speed. And let's look at who ended up being more successful. And I found out, okay, guys, obviously guys with both is, ideal, but if you can only have one, power tends to be the one that translates at the NFL level a little bit more consistently than speed. Stuff like that. So I figured let's do it with quarterbacks, right? Everyone's trying to figure out what makes a quarterback good. Well, this isn't the worst way to kind of figure out which traits really matter. So that's what I did. I looked at a bunch of different quarterbacks that were, and I mostly focused on guys who were, drafted relatively early. So I just did first and second round quarterbacks and just looked at the traits that they had and which ones translated to the NFL, which ones didn't. We got some small sample sizes here in certain traits. Some guys, some traits don't really get talked about too much. And I want to talk both, positive and negative traits. So that's what I decided to do. I have a scoring system here. Again, this is not a perfectly scientifically approved study by any means. I say I like the scientific method. Doesn't mean that everything is going to be perfectly, it's going to be a math problem necessarily. It doesn't always work out that way because, like I said, can't exactly do that in football. But I tried to make it as close as I could. So what I did was, I looked at basically everyone's Walter football page, which is a good sort of it's for scouting college prospects, and just said, okay, if you have one of, 10 select traits, I'm just going to write it down as this player had this trait. Then what I wanted to do is look at the overall list and see, how well that group of players ended up being at the NFL level. To do that, I needed some sort of scoring system to make it work as best as I could. So I decided to rank each quarterback 1 through 4. 1 being you're just a trash quarterback, 2 being you have some value but not really as a starter, 3 is a starter, and 4 is just an awesome quarterback. That's the scoring system. And so let's look at what the results were. So this is the first chart. This is the main chart we're going to look at here. So just so you know what you're looking at. So on the left column, you have just the traits, if it says con in front of it, that means it was a con. So the top trait is if you were considered to be a bad quarterback in the accuracy department, which is weird. Why is that the top trait? Because the next one is what your average score was. You're going to see some, not a huge difference in a lot of these. I mean, the highest was 2.6, the lowest was 2.0, and the highest was considered a con. And we're also dealing with small sample sizes. SS at the right, that is just sample size. So for this one, a sample size of 8, how much do you want to take into consideration there? I just don't know. I think this is a fun exercise to do. I don't know how scientific it is, as I keep saying. But anyways, I think it's interesting to some degree. Let's keep going down. So a quick release was actually the second best trait and the best positive trait you see here. We also have a con being footwork. You also have a high likelihood of being successful. Good IQ is going to be the next one here, followed by good size, and then immediately followed by a con size, which both have 2.4. So maybe size doesn't really mean that much. Over towards the bottom, kind of stuff that you, I think, pay more attention to typically when you're scouting: mobility, strong arm, and accuracy. One thing that's interesting, though, is that if your con is football IQ, it does seem to be a pretty significant jump from if a strength is football IQ. So what do we make of all of this? Let's look at this first panel. These are the traits to throw out question mark. That question mark is key here. I don't know how much we're going to really say, okay, let's throw it out because of the sample size of 20 guys. Let's, get rid of that. Although I think it's also fair to say, listen, Football changes quickly, and we have to deal with small sample sizes here to some degree. So the questionable traits, we were dealing with accuracy, footwork, and size. So if your con is accuracy, you actually are more likely to be successful in these past, 20 quarterbacks that had that as part of their Walter football profile. And if it was a con to be accurate, you were actually better than if it was a pro to be accurate. Something like footwork, which nobody really put as a strength in enough categories for me to put that even as a small sample size. If you didn't have at least 5 guys, I just threw it out. But if your con was footwork, your score was 2.5. As I said, that was the third highest on this list, which kind of, I think you can make some arguments, and I think I can understand this to some degree. For things like accuracy and footwork, maybe they just don't matter as much at the NFL level as people think they do. And for guys that are good enough to have a con being accuracy or footwork and still get drafted in the first or second round, they actually end up playing better than guys who the accuracy is what they rely on. Maybe that's something. Also, for the size, it seems like whether it's a con or a pro or a con, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really seem to have too big of an impact, which basically I think means that we put the right amount of emphasis on size probably. There is some value there, but we shouldn't only draft based on size. That's kind of what I would think. So I wouldn't say we should throw out any of these charts necessarily. Like obviously, accuracy, footwork, and size, obviously all that stuff can help you at the NFL level. There's no denying that. But maybe we overvalue things like accuracy and footwork to some degree, and maybe, even size as well. As for the there may be something there chart, quick release being good, there may be something there. Like I could see that being an undervalued trait because getting the ball off quickly and getting rid of the ball quickly matters more at the NFL level than the college level. And it does seem like if that's a positive trait for you, you are more likely to be successful than some of these other traits. So there may be something there. I don't think there's enough information to say there definitely is. And also for, IQ, does seem like there may be something there. Guys who have better football IQ tend to do better than guys who don't if you're drafted in the first or second round. Finally, for the needs more information, stuff like mobility and strong arm. One of the issues here is that, the sample size of 29 for a strong arm, that feels like a good sample size, but the issue is there just wasn't that big of a sample size of guys who didn't have a strong arm. I went back a decade compiling this list, and basically everyone who was drafted in the first or second round, it was considered a pro that they had a strong arm. And maybe it's because the difference between having like a good college strong arm versus a bad college strong arm is just different than it is in the NFL, I think. Like there's plenty of guys in the NFL now who we don't necessarily consider having strong arms that still technically get credit for having a strong arm. And same thing with mobility is that, kind of just being like decent at it, they'll typically throw it in there. So that's why it actually might not be. It's almost like there isn't enough sample size of guys who don't have these two traits for me to really feel comfortable saying, oh, well, we paid too much attention to it. So where do we go from here? I think one thing I can think of is if you're not the most accurate quarterback or you don't have the best footwork and you're still considered good enough to be a first or second round pick, you're probably pretty good. And your traits that you have that are outside of that are going to be better, those are the traits that'll probably carry over into the NFL and allow you to be successful there. I think that football IQ is probably very important. I think to some degree we kind of view this stuff as, oh, well, if there's a dumb quarterback who's a great athlete, let's just teach him how to be smarter and then he'll be a great athlete who's smart and can do great. But the difference is that smart quarterbacks also get smarter. Being smart doesn't only work in one direction. It's not you get to a certain point and you plateau. So that might be another factor that maybe isn't getting paid enough attention to is that football IQ aspect and decision making. And one weird thing about IQ in general with football, the football variety, of course, not talking about the other kind, is part of me just wonders, like, there's two separate things. There's pre-snap stuff, which you can kind of learn and get better at. And then there's, when you're under pressure and like you have to make decisions, that seemingly like nobody gets better at. You're pretty much just good or bad at that. That doesn't really seem to get much better over time, even though you think it should be able to. So I wonder if, like, I don't know how much is at play for either of that stuff. So yeah, I guess my final verdict, maybe pay a little bit more attention to how good of reads do you make and stuff like that, and a little bit less attention to how accurate you are and how good of your footwork is, and maybe also pay attention to quick release. That's another thing that matters. That's what I think about all this. What do you guys think? Is it worthless? Should I just throw it out? There's an argument to be made there. I think that there's some value here, but it's not something that's going to completely like change the way you view football. But not every one of my videos is going to completely change the way you view football. Some are just kind of interesting. So that's what I think this one falls into. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.